Irene Malqued, my mother, was born May 10th, 1933 in Sagunto, Sison, Pangasinan, Philippines. Simeon and Fermina Malqued had six children. Betty, Estras, Irene, my mother, was the third of six siblings, Phoebe, Nena, and Napoleon. In this small barrio of Sagunto, she had a childhood love to be a deaconess, but it turned out she went to nursing instead. I've been told the story that my mother was the first person from Sagunto to graduate from nursing school. I'd like to believe that's true. She passed her nursing board exam and got her nursing license in September 1957. She first worked at the Bethany Hospital at nearby La Union for a year, and that's where she met Leo Florendo, my father. She wasn't too impressed by him at first.
When he came, he did not introduce himself to me. So I snubbed him. I said to my attendant, tell that guy to get out of my office. And he's not supposed to be reading those charges. So he said, oh, this nurse is a aristocrat. He said she had bad impression on me too. And he said, you will see. I'll just observe. He said. So the following morning, the director of the church introduced him to be our new doctor that just is starting. And so me and my attendant will just look at each other. Oh, we didn't know he was a doctor. So I snubbed him.
My father couldn't resist her charm and beauty, of course, when they worked together as doctor and nurse, and they fell in love in the late 1950s. My father wanted to marry her right away, but no, no, no. She had other plans.
He wants to marry me before I go to the States. And I said no, because my parents, sold our property to go to the United States. And why will I marry now? No, I don't. If you are really true to me, for 2 years, you can wait for me.
In 1959, my mother was one of the 13 exchange students for further postgraduate study in obstetric nursing at the Margaret Haig Maternity Hospital in Jersey City, New Jersey, United States. She also worked at the Cook County Hospital in Chicago, Illinois for 2 years. Basically, she made my father wait 3 years for her. Now that's playing hard to get. Here's where my dad's story and my mom's story are slightly different. My dad wrote in his book, "For 3 years, I could not endure life without Irene and asked Irene to be my wife, which convinced her to finally come back home to the Philippines on February 27th, 1961. We didn't want to waste any more time, so we eloped and got married in the civil court in San Juan City the following day, February 28th, 1961. Then we married again in a church in Baguio on March 18th, 1961. Typical man's point of view. Boy meets girl, boy gets girl. My mom's story is slightly different. She made him wait a little bit longer.
When I went back, nobody was there except him. On the third day, we got married, and then he brought me home to Sison.
My father and mother worked as a doctor and nurse team in Abatan from the early 1960s to 1971. They started from a small tent clinic and asked the U.S. military to donate supplies and medicine. They provided much needed medical care for the people in the mountain provinces, even if it was still a very fierce headhunting area. For a long time, they had only each other, but eventually, together with local people and the Lutheran Church funding, they built a hospital in Abatan. Now, in 2022, there are 250 plus beds in the hospital in Abatan. So naturally, 1 year after my mom agreed to marry my dad and living in a very rural mountain province, Mary Beth was born in 1962, Caroline was born 2 years later in 1964, and I was born in 1965. We all grew up in Abatan, and my mom and dad were model parents for us. Even with 3 kids, my mom understood the value of education, and she studied hard and persevered to earn her undergraduate Bachelor of Science degree in nursing at the University of the Philippines in 1967. The Florendo family first came to the United States in 1971, where we eventually ended up in New Orleans, where my father earned his medical degree from Tulane University. It was my mother who worked to support the family while my dad completed his medical studies. My mother once more followed my father on his medical mission for the Lutheran Church in Nigeria, Africa, from July 1972 to June 1975. Once again, my mother volunteered as a nurse helping my father at the hospital and also in the jungle clinics. Just like so many mountain province Filipinos, African Nigerian men, women, and children all received my mother's skilled medical care as a volunteer nurse. For so many years, she did not get paid for her amazing skills. With the medical mission in Nigeria complete, we moved to Southern California in 1975. For most of her working life, my mother worked as a neonatal intensive care unit nurse at San Bernardino County Hospital, 12 hours each day caring for only 2 tiny premature babies. And finally, she was paid for her work. After 30 years as a NICU nurse, she retired from nursing in the mid-1990s. She has taken care of 3 of her own children, 4 grandchildren, 3 great-grandchildren, and hundreds of medical patients in the Philippines, Nigeria, and the US, including hundreds of premature babies. My mother gave her love to so many people. Many of you probably have your own set of stories about how she shared her love with you. We lost our father and she lost her beloved husband in 2014. My mother couldn't bear to sit across from the empty chair where my father used to sit for meals. So instead of looking at the empty chair, she decided she would just sit in his chair. She was cute in that way. In June of this year, 2022, my mother moved from the US back to Sagunto, following the death of her sister Phoebe. Everyone told me she absolutely loved being back in her childhood home in Sagunto. I recently heard so many wonderful stories about my mother from various Sagunto community members, about how she did this and she did that with some of the people of Sagunto. She was loved and respected by so many people in Sagunto. And she loved them all back in her own special way, treating them to weekly lunches at Jollibee, for example. She spoke at the local church, and she sang with them. Singing, in fact, was to become a saving grace for her during her last month with us. This part of her story will hopefully allow you to briefly understand the struggles and the triumphs near the end of her story. In mid-September, my mother suffered a stroke and was hospitalized. After a week or so, she recovered enough to go home to Sagunto.
I am going home. I am going home. I am going home.
Do you know who I am? Huh?
Yeah. And you.
Yeah.
Oh, good job.
But on the second day of being home, she suffered another stroke and was hospitalized again. My sister Caroline and I and Daisy all witnessed the stroke happen right in front of us. We were getting her ready for breakfast, sitting her up and moving her from the bed to the table to eat. And suddenly her right arm dropped and her face drooped. Caroline is a medical professional, and she recognized the symptoms right away. I had been with my mom for only 8 hours when this second stroke changed everything. We eventually transported her to Lorma Medical Center via a 1.5 hour long, very bumpy van ambulance ride on very bumpy Filipino province roads. Caroline and I spent the next 10 to 12 days, 24/7 by her side at Lorma. The stroke had essentially reduced my mother to someone who knew lots of words to communicate with, but her brain couldn't make the connections from her thoughts to the words she already knew, and the mechanics of speaking the words. For several days, she would just yell out randomly.
Hi. 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 Hi.
What would seem like yells of pain. but in many instances of yelling, she wasn't in pain. We finally figured out that she was in fact singing, but to us it sounded like random yells. Singing became her saving grace and one of her ways of communicating with us. We realized that we had to essentially teach her how to speak again. We had to teach her when and how to say hello or hi, and when and how to say thank you. Small victories like being able to count to 10 in English and Ilocano became incredible moments of joy for us.
1, 2, 3.
4,
1, 2, 3.
4.
1, 2, 3.
Sa Ilocano nga, may sa...
Mata, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
She knew enough to say I love you too when we said it to her. We were hopeful. I stayed with my mom 24/7, and Caroline ventured out to get everything my mom needed when she returned home to Sagunto. Hospital bed, recliner chair, sheets, pillows, etc. Because it looked like she would eventually recover enough to go home. But more and more problems manifested themselves, and she regressed. The blocked blood vessels in her left leg caused very dark discoloration, and cold feet were of great concern. Amputation was even discussed. Blood thinners to help the leg clots couldn't be prescribed because of the possibility of causing another stroke. Her small victories in speaking became less and less. Hope was fading. Even so, my sister and I wanted the best care for her that the local hospital in the province could not provide for her because they had very limited resources and expertise. So we arranged to transport her via 2-propeller plane to Manila's St. Luke's Medical Center, which is considered one of the best, if not the best, hospital in the Philippines. Interestingly enough, my very young and single father in the 1950s was actually a doctor for a while at St. Luke's. Not the same building, because it's now a relatively new facility, but the previous hospital with the same name. Life's many interesting circles. The 10 very skilled doctors at St. Luke's, each with a different specialty, that looked after my mother, wanted to figure out the root cause of the stroke. Each doctor asked many of the same questions, and of course ordered many CT scans, MRIs, and blood tests for several days. They were an incredible team of professionals on a valiant mission to help my mom. The mystery of the stroke was finally diagnosed and confirmed when a scope was placed down her throat to get a better look at her heart, where they found, quote, the largest blood clot I've ever seen, unquote, swirling around in her heart. Parts of the clot had probably broken off to cause the stroke, both strokes, and the blocked arteries in her legs. At the age of 89, aggressive heart surgery was out of the question, and so logically, blood thinners were prescribed. Once we understood the problem and the solution of blood thinner medication, and with my mother's condition getting worse by the minute despite the medication, Caroline and I decided that instead of nurses giving her medicine in the hospital, our wonderful family in Sagunto could do exactly the same and do so with so much more love and caring. So in the evening after taking care of our paperwork, we, in essence, snuck away from the hospital, hired a driver to drive us 5 hours north to Sagunto. For several days, my mother was able to receive visitors from the community in her home. She floated in and out of consciousness. Different groups came to pray and to sing for her. We listened to many stories about her. She smiled often and had a sparkle in her eye. She was receiving so much love from everyone.
Was blind, but now I see. One more time.
For me personally, in a quiet moment when I was the only one with her, she opened her eyes and I told her I loved her. She spoke back very clearly to me, I love you too. Those were the last coherent words she ever spoke to me. And I will never forget that moment. Almost every night for a month, she would sleep sing or sleep talk, basically bursts of 3 notes or one long
Amen.
for many hours at a time. One night, she was sleep talking quite coherently in Ilocano. Daisy translated for us, saying that my mother was talking to my long deceased father and her long deceased mother and father, saying she will see them soon. It was actually quite cute. She sounded like she was a child again. During those last days, only in her sleep did she ever speak clearly. We had a big Filipino style feast in honor of her. She saw us preparing for the feast, and a few hours prior to the gathering, she fell asleep and slept through the entire event. But she was at the center of the festivities. Little did we know that that was the last time she would be awake. After 30 or so hours of slow, difficult breathing while unconscious, she took her last shallow breath and peacefully passed away on October 17th, 2022 at 9:40 a.m. during a prayer in her home in Sagunto, while surrounded by many caring and loving family and community members. My mother is now with her husband, her father, and her mother, and although we will miss her dearly, her life of 89 years was full of love given and received.